My name is Ken Love. I'm making this presentation in an effort to convince the LeadNow community to take specific action on Bill C-12, the proposed Canadian Net Zero Accountability Act. When Bill C-12 was first introduced, a lot of people thought it was a good idea. After all, it contains net zero and accountability in the title, so how could it be bad? Well, in fact, Bill C-12 is a good idea, but in its present form, it contains some serious flaws. These can be fixed with amendments, but right now is the most important time to seek those amendments. I want to do three things here. First, to tell you something about Bill C-12. Second, to identify some problems with it and suggest some amendments. Finally, to suggest what to do about it and why now is the time to do it. Let's start with the bill. Particularly, let's start with what Bill C-12 does not do. Bill C-12, or any accountability act, is not a plan about how the government reduces GHG emissions. None of these things belong in Bill C-12. I point out a Made in Canada Green New Deal with millions of decent jobs and decent unionized climate jobs for everyone who wants one, because a petition has already called for that, and I know many of you folks want it. Good for you, but that needs to go into the plan and not into the statute that forces a government to make the plan. Think about it this way. I hope you campaign as hard as you like to get the NDP and Greens elected in the next federal election. But despite your efforts, you might still end up with a Conservative government. And the Conservatives are never going to introduce the Green New Deal that you want. They're Conservatives. They are already calling for amendments to add protection for Alberta oil production to Bill C-12. That doesn't belong in C-12 either. If you try to put anything except for the requirement for targets and plans for GHG reductions into Bill C-12, you are simply increasing the probability that a future Conservative government will repeal the statute and then do nothing about climate change. Just as important, you're taking the focus off the key elements of Bill C-12 that really need to be amended. If we can't agree on this, and you can't see fit to leave social justice issues out of your C-12 lobbying, I hope you will at least lobby for a couple of the problems identified below first. Let's turn to what Bill C-12 does do. It requires that the government set a target for greenhouse gas emissions that it must achieve by a specific date, called a milestone year. Very importantly, this is not just one date 3 decades away, but several shorter dates, usually in 5-year intervals. Canada has never achieved any of its stated greenhouse gas emissions targets. We won't achieve a target a decade from now or 3 decades from now if we can't achieve a target 5 years from now. Bill C-12 creates an advisory body to advise the government on a plan to meet that target. The government creates and publishes the plan. The government's progress in meeting the target is evaluated. The government's success in achieving the target is evaluated. And finally, there are some sort of consequences if a government fails to achieve the plan for a milestone year. This is the accountability part. Put another way, Bill C-12 is about how much do we reduce by, how many megatons, by when, who makes the plan, who evaluates progress, and who evaluates whether the target was achieved. And finally, what are the consequences if a government fails to make progress or achieve the target? Does anyone need to do anything if the government is off track on progress? Does anybody need to do anything if the government fails to achieve the target? Are there any other consequences? Again, this is the accountability part. The next part is important. 2 of the countries that are about as similar to Canada as it gets in terms of laws and government are the United Kingdom and New Zealand. Both of them have already enacted climate change accountability statutes. The United Kingdom's Climate Change Act has been in place since November 2008. It has been tremendously successful in helping Britain to already make GHG reductions that put Canada to shame. You can see that here. New Zealand has had a Climate Change Response Act since 2002, but in November of 2019, it enacted detailed and comprehensive amendments that established an accountability system very similar to Britain's. And here in Canada, the federal government introduced Bill C-12 with first reading on November 19th. It's now in second reading, which means that the opposition parties have some opportunity to debate it. It's only really when you compare the way that Bill C-12 addresses the relevant issues to the way that the UK and New Zealand Acts do so that you see the major flaws in Bill C-12. So let's turn to some of the problems with Bill C-12. We'll consider the top three. The first is that the first milestone year, which is the first time that a government will actually be held accountable for meeting a GHG reduction target, is much too far into the future. The second is that the advisory body's role on planned is too weak and ill-defined. The third is that the Environment Commissioner's role on evaluating anything is too weak and ill-defined. Let's look at the first milestone year and the first report. When the UK Act came into force, its first milestone year, using Bill C-12's terminology and not the British terminology, was 5 years into the future. When the New Zealand Act came into force, its first milestone year was also about 5 years into the future. For Canada's Bill C-12, the first milestone year, which is the first time any government will be held accountable for meeting a target, is fixed as 2030. At the time of first reading, that was 10 years into the future. Consider what this means. The Canada Elections Act fixes regular federal general elections to be held on a date in October every 4 years. A minority government can lose a confidence vote before that, and there might be an earlier election, but that only increases the number of future governments. So under the Canada Elections Act, the next regular election will be in October of 2023. Beginning with our present government, here's how long our next few governments will be in office. Section 14.1 of Bill C-12 states that the government must provide its first and only progress report on meeting its target for its first milestone year no later than 2 years before the start of the milestone year. That means the deadline date for the Environment Minister on behalf of the government to table the first progress report is the 31st of December 2027. That means no progress report from this government, or based on the strict deadlines, the next one, not until 2 governments into the future. The first milestone year is currently 2030, and it takes 2 years for the scientists to provide the information on how many megatons of GHGs were emitted in a given year. C-12 takes this into account and calls on the minister to provide the assessment report on success or failure in achieving the target for a milestone year 2 years after the milestone year. That means the first assessment report on whether the government actually met its first target will not be due until 2032, over 11 years from now. That means no assessment report and no accountability from this government, or the next one, or the next one, not until 3 governments into the future. Meanwhile, consider the climate change situation that Canada and the world is in. This comes from a well-known report by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The report finds that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would require rapid and far-reaching transitions in land, energy, industry, buildings, transport, and cities. Global net human-caused emissions of carbon dioxide would need to fall by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, reaching net zero around 2050. What we do in the next decade is critical. To have climate accountability legislation with no accountability until 2 years after the critical decade ends is obscene. This is the one and only of the glaring flaws with Bill C-12 that can be fixed with an easy amendment. Here is the current definition of milestone year in Section 2, which is the definition section of Bill C-12. And here is the amendment, 1 comma and 4 digits, 2025, comma. The next two flaws with Bill C-12 are really just as bad, but the amendments to fix them will be more complicated. The next glaring flaw is that the advisory body's role on plans is too weak and ill-defined. The UK combines the mandates of advising the minister on the target and plan for a milestone year and evaluating progress toward that target in one body, called the Commission. New Zealand also combines the mandates of advising the minister and evaluating progress in one body, this time called the Committee. Like the UK, New Zealand also uses budgets and budgetary periods rather than targets for milestone years. Bill C-12 gives some ambiguous mandate for advising the minister on targets and plans for a milestone year to the advisory body. It gives some ambiguous mandate for evaluating progress to the Environment Commissioner. In 2018, the London School of Economics published a paper analysing how the UK Climate Change Act had worked out over its first 10 years. It was largely favourable. What it said about the Climate Change Committee and its role as the advisory body advising on targets and plans is very insightful. I'm not going to read each of these next 4 slides, but I will pause just long enough so that, if you want to read them, you can press pause and read them for yourself. The gist of it is that this body of technical experts is seen as better equipped than politicians to make the complex and long-term plans required to address climate change. The committee is made up of experts from several relevant fields and has a strong staff. It's not a legal enforcer, but an advisory body. However, the Climate Change Act is written so that if the government deviates from the committee's advice, the government must provide a formal explanation on why it did so. The authors, and those they canvassed for the analysis, found the committee to be an effective mechanism against the weaknesses of politicians. Many saw it as an incredibly powerful voice and the ultimate provider of high-quality information and analysis in the UK climate debate. The UK Act sets out very clearly what the committee's advisory role is and the deference that the minister should give it. Quote, "It is the committee's duty," end quote, and this comes right out of the statute, to advise the minister on the level of the carbon budget for each period, how the budget should be met, and which sectors should make reductions. The minister, quote, "must take into account the advice of the committee," end quote. If the minister, quote, "makes provision different from that recommended by the committee, the minister must publish a statement setting out the reasons for that decision," end quote. The New Zealand Act is similar. The Commission must advise the minister on the recommended quantity of emissions in each emissions budget and how the emissions budget may realistically be met. The minister must provide a written response to the advice received from the Commission. If the minister's proposed emissions budget departs from the advice of the Commission, the minister must explain the reasons for any departure from the Commission's advice. Here's what Bill C-12 states. There is established an advisory body to provide the minister advice with respect to achieving net zero emissions by 2050, including advice respecting measures that the government could implement to implement an emissions target. There is no detail. The minister must publicly respond to the advice, but there is nothing about what the minister's response must contain. It's clear then that in its capacity as the advisory body, the UK Commission does most of the heavy work on advising on setting the target and making the plan for a milestone year. The New Zealand system is almost identical to the UK, but the body is called the Committee. Also, like the UK, the New Zealand Act contained more text on the selection, composition, and function of the committee than there is in all of Bill C-12. For Canada, the advisory body has an ambiguous, if any, mandate to advise on the target and the plan for a milestone year. The ministers could simply say, thanks to the advisory body for the advice, and then ignore it. I suggest that we lobby our MPs then to review the portions of the UK Act and the New Zealand Act that address the selection, composition, functions, and mandates of the respective commissions and committees, especially as they pertain to their advisory work. Both acts are very similar and very detailed. Then we ask the MPs to amend Bill C-12 to ensure that the advisory body has similar independence, expertise, authority, and power. Just before we turn to the third and final problem considered here, this is a good time to note that key members of the NDP, the Green Party, and the Bloc Québécois have all clearly and coherently raised these flaws in Bill C-12 and called for amendments. Laurel Collins, the NDP environment critic, gave an excellent speech that touched on most of the problems with Bill C-12, as did Christina Michaud for the Bloc. Elizabeth May said that Bill C-12 in its present form is so weak that she cannot support it. I believe that Nathaniel Erskine Smith, a Liberal, is the current MP with the record for voting against his party the most times. He was diplomatic in his criticism, but he highlighted many of the same problems that the others did and expressed hope that C-12 could be amended before it is voted on. I'll come back to why this might be a problem later. Let's turn now to the third and final problem we'll look at here. The fact that the mandate of the Environment Commissioner to evaluate anything is too weak and ill-defined. There are two components to this: evaluating progress, meaning interim progress before we get to a milestone year, and evaluating achievement of the target after a milestone year. Evaluating progress. Under the UK Act, it is the duty of the committee to lay before Parliament each year a report setting out the committee's views on progress toward meeting the budgets, the further progress needed, and whether the budgets are likely to be met. The Minister must lay before Parliament a response to the points raised by the committee. The New Zealand Commission must prepare an annual report that includes measured emissions for the most recent year available. The report must include an assessment of the adequacies of the emissions reduction plan and any new opportunities to reduce emissions. The Minister must present to the House a response to the report which notes any amendments to the Minister's plan. Under Bill C-12, the Minister must prepare one and only one progress report no later than 2 years before the start of the milestone year. The advisory body must submit an annual report, quote, with respect to its advice and activities, end quote. The Minister must publicly respond. The overall fundamental flaw with Bill C-12 is that it's incredibly vague in general about almost every issue it addresses. When you include the schedules to the respective acts, the UK Act and the New Zealand Act each contain well over 150 sections. Bill C-12 contains 29. I won't take you through the wording on these next few slides, but you can use the pause button if you want. Here is the detail of the UK Act regarding progress reports. Here's the detail of the New Zealand Act. It's in the details where you find the content of what the evaluations must contain and the Minister's obligation to respond in a particular manner. And here's Bill C-12. Compared to the UK Act and the New Zealand Act, Bill C-12 contains very little detail or specifics. In terms of who, between the advisory body and the Environment Commissioner, has the power to do evaluations, it's clear that the advisory body does not have that power. Bill C-12 has given no detail about what the advisory body must report on, beyond its advice and activities. The advisory body has not been given any mandate to evaluate anything, let alone the Minister's progress report. Well, the Minister must publicly respond to the advice that the advisory body includes in its annual report with respect to measures and sectoral strategies that the Government of Canada could implement there's no detail about what the minister's response must include. Presumably, thanks for the advice, I'll consider it, would be an acceptable public response by the minister under section 22 sub 2. Nobody has the job of evaluating whether the progress report is accurate, whether the minister is on track to meet the target for the milestone year, or whether the minister should take further action. The advisory body's mandate is apparently limited to advice that it includes in its annual report with respect to measures and sectoral strategies that the Government of Canada could implement. Although perhaps it could discuss the minister's assessment report in its next annual report on its activities, if it feels like it. The Environment Commissioner has no mandate to evaluate the progress report, although perhaps the Environment Commissioner can mention it in his or her next 5-year report, if he or she remembers. This is a Mack truck. And this is Bill C-12. And that's because you can drive a Mack truck through the holes in Bill C-12. Just before we finish up, let's compare what happens at the end of a milestone year. In the UK, 2 years after a milestone year, or the budgetary period, the minister must lay before Parliament a detailed statement about having met or not met the target. If the target was not met, the minister must explain why not. As soon as practicable after that, the minister must lay before Parliament a plan to compensate in future periods for excess emissions. There's the detail. The New Zealand Act is functionally identical to the UK Act. Also, in both acts, the Environment Commissioner, meaning the UK Committee or the New Zealand Commission, must lay before Parliament its views on the way in which the target for the milestone year, or budget, was or was not met, including for New Zealand, any banking or borrowing from other budgets, and the Minister must lay before Parliament a response to the points raised by the Environment Commissioner. And there's the detail for the New Zealand Act. Under Bill C-12, the Minister must prepare an assessment report 2 years after a milestone year. The advisory body has no mandate to evaluate it. The Environment Commissioner might or might not comment on the Minister's assessment the next time he or she does a 5-year report. The Environment Commissioner has no specific mandate to do so. The Minister has no obligation to table a plan to make up for any shortfall. The Minister has no obligation to respond to the Environment Commissioner's report. And there's the Canadian detail, or lack thereof. Compared to the UK Act and the New Zealand Act, Bill C-12 contains extremely little detail or specifics. Nobody has the mandate to evaluate whether the assessment report is accurate, whether the minister met the target for the milestone year, or whether the minister should do anything if the target was not achieved. The advisory body's mandate is apparently limited to advice that it includes in its annual report with respect to measures and sectoral strategies that the Government of Canada could implement, although perhaps it could discuss the minister's assessment report in its next annual report on its activities if it wanted. Beyond the provisions of section 24(1) and 2 of Bill C-12, the Environment Commissioner has no mandate to evaluate the assessment report, although again, perhaps the Environment Commissioner can mention it in his or her next 5-year report. We should ask our MPs to review the portions of the UK Act and the New Zealand Act that address the evaluation mandates of the respective commissions and committees, both for the evaluation of progress reports and for the achievement of targets for milestone years. Both acts are very similar and very detailed. We should also ask the MPs then to amend Bill C-12 to ensure that the Environment Commissioner has similar independence, expertise, authority, and power. That's enough to cover here, but there are other serious flaws with Bill C-12. To simply mention the next three, the first is that the advisory body is selected by the minister and not by an independent selection body. There are really no consequences if a government fails to achieve a target in a milestone year. The minister must simply file a report. Lastly, Bill C-12 is structured around targets for milestone years rather than around carbon budgets, as both the United Kingdom and New Zealand use. As with the top three problems, the UK Act and the New Zealand Act deal with all three issues better than Bill C-12 does. It's time to do something, and the time to do it is absolutely now. Why now? Bill C-12 received first reading in the House of Commons on the 19th of November 2020. It was debated on second reading on the 25th and 26th of November. That website there is an excellent place to keep up to date on what's going on with C-12. On the 26th of November, the government House leaders stated that debate on C-12 would resume again on Wednesday the 2nd of December. For some reason it didn't. It will probably receive at least one more day of debate and then go to the Commons Environment Committee by the end of January 2021. After amendments recommended from committee, it is extremely rare for there to be any further amendments to a bill before it's voted on. As soon as the Environment Committee finishes hearing public submissions, our opportunity to influence amendments is effectively over. In terms of influence, we then basically turn into pumpkins. That could be as early as mid-February. As I mentioned earlier, during the debates on second reading, the NDP, the Green Party, and the Bloc clearly and coherently discussed the flaws in Bill C-12 and demanded amendments. But as I said, here's the problem. The Conservative Party has indicated that it might well support Bill C-12 in something close to its present form. But look at the reasons why. This is from the speech of the Conservative environment critic. At this point, I probably sound quite negative about the bill. That is not actually my intent. We know the Prime Minister is an expert at making promises he will never have to be responsible for. Setting targets 30 years down the line means that future governments have 30 years to figure it out. More importantly, industry has the time to come up with much needed solutions. Then later, the reality is, from my perspective, there is really nothing to oppose in this bill. In many respects, it is a Seinfeld bill. It is largely devoid of details or costs. Now look at that bottom line. Despite the NDP, the Greens, and the Bloc, the Liberals and the Conservatives together have enough votes in the House of Commons to pass Bill C-12 in its present form. What can we do? Tell the Liberals that Bill C-12 is not good enough. Show them how much better the UK Act and the New Zealand Act are, and politely, or otherwise, shame them into doing better through amendments. Buttress the NDP, the Greens, and the Bloc in their pursuit of amendments to Bill C-12. We know what to ask for. Make 2025 the first milestone year. Follow the UK Act and the New Zealand Act to make sure that the advisory body has similar independence, expertise, authority, and power for setting targets and making plans. Follow the UK Act and the New Zealand Act and make sure that the Environment Commissioner has similar independence, expertise, authority, and power for evaluating progress and for evaluating achievement after a milestone year. Very importantly, LeadNow is ideally suited to do this. Remember a year ago how successful the Reject Tech campaign was. Use the LeadNow Slack website to organize groups of people in each riding. Arrange for the groups to have a Zoom meeting with their MPs, politely and respectfully, or in whatever personal style you like. Explain the problems with Bill C-12. Explain how it can be amended, and listen to what the MP has to say. Ask them what other efforts you can take in your advocacy. You might be surprised by their answers. I know this by personal experience. I've spoken to a couple of MPs, and I was very surprised at what they suggested. They were good suggestions. If you can't meet with your MP, at least make sure that several people in each riding email and/or phone the MP. Write your own emails. Don't just sign an automated one. By all means, use the information in this presentation to help you. Also, identify LeadNow members who are good at social media and collaborate with them on the message, both for MP's social media platforms and for the general public. Well, that's all I got for you. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I hope you're convinced that this is the kind of project that LeadNow is ideally suited to undertake, and that now is the time to do it. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Thanks for watching.